Chapter 7, Security by Design. Introduction. One way to try and make the vague yet pervasive problem of security tractable is to understand it architecturally. Rebuilding after truck bomb attacks, such as the Oklahoma City bombing or the U.S. Embassy bombings in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi in 1998, an obvious concern is to ensure that explosive-laden trucks not be allowed so close to buildings. The general problem of security, then, can be and is specified, if not exhausted, by the far more tractable problem of managing truck traffic. There are things that can be bought, that can be built, that keep trucks away from buildings. In a process sometimes called target hardening, security imperatives inform reconstruction. U.S. embassies all over the world have been rebuilt as fortresses or replaced by new, more defensible buildings, often farther from the center of the city. From rebuilding after an attack to attempting to achieve security by design ex ante is but a short step. Design here covers a large range of intentional enterprises, from international negotiations to technical blueprints for a specific building. As noted in Chapter 1, the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, governs the general security of international aerial life. Institutionally, ICAO measures, and more generally evolving senses of best practices, are transposed by the Airports Council International, ACI, into guidelines for specific airports. If such guidelines are not realized, there is a risk that planes do not land. Through such not entirely soft law practices, airport security practices are standardized, if not perfectly, worldwide. The entire process is a remarkable example of an efficacious international jurisgenerative practice. A couple of brief excerpts provide the flavor. This advisory bulletin is addressed to ACI members and identifies a number of options and best practices airports can use to protect landside spaces. Not all of the measures identified would be the responsibility of the airport. In many instances, airports own the real estate landside, but the responsibility for public spaces lies with local law enforcement. However, the measures below can be used in discussion with local authorities and national regulators when determining the risk level and appropriate actions. The top priority should be to agree responsibility and accountability for measures between the airport and the regulator. We move on to a section entitled Building Design. Consider infrastructure and airport design features to mitigate the threat from attack. These might include, bullet points, blast proofing, the use of materials to minimize damage, such as shatterproof glass, bollards, flower pots, and other structures to prevent drive-in attacks, the separation of vehicle drop-off and pickup points from the terminal entrance through the use of a concourse or other pedestrianized area, and the management of space to reduce gatherings of people. Reduce access to areas, such as terraces, where an active shooter or bomber might have access to crowded public areas. Reduce areas where items can be hidden, such as opaque rubbish bins or concealed corners. When new buildings are planned near the airport, engage with local planning authorities to ensure that security considerations are taken into account, such as balconies, terraces, or windows that open close to the terminal building. When designing new terminal buildings, ensure that security considerations are taken into account. Retrofitting is more expensive. ACI 2017, 1-3 PSIM. And so forth. To generalize, a new embassy, airport, or even a less high-value target like a park or streetscape is inscribed by the interests of its builders, including security. As noted in the introductory chapter, airports and other critical infrastructure reflect and express fears of events that might be prevented, or at least contained, if the castle is built correctly. From this perspective, construction is a collective present expression of articulated anxieties about the future. Castles and cannons. Jan and Margaret, not their real names, are white South African expats. They live in Kenya, where they run a company that designs security systems for private and commercial use, sells the hardware, and manages the installations. Jan has the curious but effective habit of telling stories in dialogue. So I always tell people when people say, I was just in Nairobi, well, did you go to bar X? No. Then you haven't been to Nairobi. Obviously, we went to Bar X, along with various friends of Jan, and perhaps we met some more there. Almost everyone we met, then and on other occasions in our fieldwork, had something to do with security. This was a recurring pattern. There was rarely any, oh, she manages a bank and he's got a construction company. although at Bar X we were joined by at least one politician. In general, however, the secret college drinks together, often and heavily. Bar X is an indoor-outdoor bar, open astonishingly late, a place for one more drink for locals, black and white, and people passing through for whatever reason. Security loitering outside, but far too close to the street, the professional scoffed, and far too easy to lob a grenade onto the patio where we were sitting. Why not put up some netting for inexpensive starters? Perhaps this was for our benefit. Mark was there studying terrorist attacks, after all, with David looking over his shoulder and wondering what it all meant in the scheme of the contemporary. Perhaps not. Security was what these people did for a living and what they shared. Somehow, conversation turned to how the security design business worked. David, rarely afraid to look ignorant, simply may have asked. Jan started a parlor game on the back of a sheet of paper that appeared from somewhere. Suppose you have a compound. In Nairobi, as in many parts of the world, that is a pretty normal thing to say, but it bears reflection. The security industry is enormous worldwide, including in the most developed countries. But in more developed countries, security is often pushed to the back of the mind, some sort of institutional responsibility, like the supply of electricity or meat. Security is vaguely the responsibility of the government, or of some large corporation, or whoever runs a gated community. It's the sort of thing that is best done discreetly, like slaughtering animals. In the United States and Europe, for example, weapons detectors in civic buildings are still somewhat disturbing. In Kenya and much of the developing world, however, such things tend to be more out in the open. Just like chickens might die out back, homes and even small businesses have armed guards. And so acquiring security, including weapons, is a fairly middle-class activity. You have this compound, Jan says, and you want to protect it, so you come to us. You've got some amount of money, let's say, and you can buy security cameras or bollards or maybe hire one of those guards in a little house. Maybe weapons are an option. In the course of the evening, there were many weapons discussions, some involving knives in kitchens, and a good deal of spousal teasing. At any rate, we went for the cameras. Where are you going to put those cameras? We pointed on the drawing to where we thought they should be placed, getting it wrong, of course, leading to clucking from most of the table. Academics. You can take them out, but... This led to a long discussion about camera placement, the vulnerabilities of cameras, maintenance, and the like. Now, Jan says, you've got some cameras, but they aren't very good. So let's say you spend a little more money. He then laid out a list of options. We weren't taking notes, so this is a loose reconstruction from memory. You can upgrade the cameras so they see in the dark, or you can add lights, or you can add backups, maybe with motion detectors. Perhaps we chose motion detectors and then learned how hard it was to keep motion detectors from going off accidentally. Monkeys, birds. People stopped checking, if they ever were checking, like the townspeople stopped coming when the boy cried wolf. None of which means, of course, that there might not be intruders or even wolves. So maybe we chose lights that might at least frighten casual burglars away. At some point, probably David, but somebody said, suppose somebody does not care about being seen. They just want into the house to kill you. This led to a discussion of bars and steel doors and entry systems and their problems. In South Africa, repeatedly, more people die from being unable to escape their burning houses due to the bars than are saved by the bars themselves. Entry systems, various forms of ID for various levels of access, constitute a huge part of Jan and Margaret's business, especially on the commercial side, but they had their weaknesses too. Okay, but suppose somebody really wants you dead. They drive up to the house, ram their way into the house. Jan increased our budget again. Choices were offered. How about rerouting the driveway? That would at the very least be inconvenient, and depending on the site, may be impossible. Also, for a commercial site, it was probably infeasible, maybe illegal. Delivery and perhaps emergency vehicles had to be able to get to the building. So maybe we should buy a security gate, perhaps with those bollards that disappear when somebody presses a button. Perhaps we could require cars to stop some distance from the house, route traffic in such a way that it could be observed before it entered the compound, and security deployed accordingly. More cameras, perhaps searched, more staff. And if they cut power to the house, this led to a discussion of power backups and communication of both data and images via satellite communication. And if they nonetheless breached, internal barriers, weapons, knife fights in kitchens, and tales of personal prowess, safe rooms. As the white cap flowed and the game went on, both the threats and the defenses became more and more elaborate, expensive, almost baroque. For every threat, Jan offered a technical solution at a price. Every solution, however, had a weakness or could be evaded by change in the attacker's tactics. David and sometimes Mark would guess. The rest of the table, including Jan and often Mark, knew better answers and corrected. Eventually, a team of commandos in armored vehicles is imagined to be smashing its way into a compound. The guards flee or are killed, but the commandos meet with heavily armed defenders. Deep within the bowels of the house, in a modern-day analog to the medieval castle's keep, the fabulously wealthy recluse huddles in his or her safe room, signaling the outside world, pleading for reinforcements. A number of points are salient, that is, stick out like the angle of a fortification. First, such games of castles and cannons have no endpoint. Given resources and interests, there is always a next move for either the attackers or the defenders. This is the architectural version of the infinite regress introduced in Chapter 2 and bureaucratized in Chapter 5. Epistemologically, the concept of security, the effort to make the uncertain future certain in the present, is self-contradictory, logically impossible. Efforts to square the circle lead to the infinite regress. Second, as we have seen already, one role for the ethnographer is to step outside the professional logic and speak from the perspective of the public. At some point, the game is over, or should be, and the logic of the game should be suspended. The compound is secure enough. Third, the fact that there is always another move does not mean that the players have much liberty. In particular, the defenders end up imprisoned by their own defenses, locked in their safe rooms. If all that Americans want is security, they can go to prison, Dwight D. Eisenhower is reported to have said. They'll have enough to eat, a bed, and a roof over their heads. Eisenhower provides a nice counterpoint to the perspective often associated with Foucault's rereading of Bentham's Panopticon, in which the state erects security measures and reduces the freedom of its citizens in an effort to secure its own power. The actor in this story is the state, not the docile individual. But that is not the only way to look at things. In Bar X, and as Eisenhower suggests, citizens might seek to be secure even at the cost of their own freedom. For obvious example, people often use electronic conveniences that spy on them. That is, build their own panopticon and give it to others, and just hope that laws are strong enough to prevent painful abuses. In one of the little ironies of the contemporary, many people who start out worrying about the state end up relying on it heavily indeed. Fourth, and sticking with Eisenhower, the evolution of security tends to restrict the freedom of the defenders, which makes the attackers attractive. We may construct the jail, build the castle's walls around us, but we are still trapped within the castle. Modernity, as Kafka understood, feels like prison. The game starts out as defending the compound or the airport from evildoers, but the defenders find themselves first thinking like the attackers. What will they do next? But such thinking almost requires imagination, dreaming. What would I do next? Everybody at the table becomes, in their minds, an attacker. Attack is where freedom, and so creativity, and a certain kind of joy lie. Knowing this, citizens may forego security, may even seek to undermine it. Old ideas about the acte gratuit resurface. Terrorism may be proof of some individual agency. Fifth, this is why it is so important to be able to stop the game, as already mentioned in the second point above. The game must be stopped before it becomes nauseating, before violence comes as a sort of relief, or even becomes attractive, because at least there one senses freedom. Landside and the problem of definition. Jan simplified the game in his favor, at least the early stages, simply by drawing a box on a piece of paper. The box subtly redefined physical security as an essentially spatial concept. Protect the space, that is the compound, and you protect the people within it. The design problem, then, is not to provide security, whatever that is, but to organize the space. That we understand, with the intention of making the space safe. Security emerges as a consequence of good design. Good design requires answers to practical, not easy, but tractable questions. Where do the trucks go? What about some planters that also serve as bollards here? Such spatial thinking runs through airport security, which traditionally has established a cordon around the planes and their passengers, that is, sought to secure the compound. This is not a question of airport design per se. Airports are high value and familiar targets, and so easy places to observe architecture responding to recent attacks and expressing the latest thinking. As already suggested, however, in any number of critical sites, measures are taken in response to threat and as imagination prompts. Collectively, such measures inflect environments. After a while, the accumulation of such sites creates a securitized, even militarized, built space. From the perspective of many in the social sciences and many citizens, the creation of such spaces is unfortunate or worse. But for a manager, the box has a subtly seductive quality. If only these issues can be contained, maybe even solved, then my job will be done. But it turns out to be harder to construct the right boxes than one might think. For decades of airport construction, the bounds of the compound were taken to be rather self-evident. The places are called airports, after all. Surely the planes define the relevant space. One significance of landside attacks was that this seemingly self-evident proposition was forcibly denied. In Europe, there is a strong desire to create seamless and smart corridors to connect the different forms of transportation. Ideally, one should be able to deplane in Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport and board the Thalys train for Paris, or take the link from Brussels' Zaventem Airport and join the Thalys train in Gare Centrale. The contemporary airport is a high-tech castle built to protect those within its walls, but this is a very extended landside zone. What of all these transportation links? This near-future vulnerability was already known before 2015, but after the Thalys train attack, the pressure increased to close any and all gaps. Since then, train companies, bus companies, and transportation agencies have moved front and center in airport security. Trains and buses are not traditionally seen as part of airports for obvious reasons, but new thinking was required in the wake of the 2015 attack. On August 21st, Thalys 9364 crossed the Belgian border, bound for Paris with 554 passengers on board. At 17:45 CST, Ayoub Al-Khazani emerged from the WC on carriage 12, stripped to the waist and carrying an AKM assault rifle. He wore a rucksack on his chest, which contained 9 ammunition magazines and a container of petrol. He also carried a Luger pistol and a box cutter knife. A Frenchman, known only as Damien A., attempted to grapple with Al-Khazani but was overpowered. 51 years old, Mark Mugalian stepped away from his wife to intervene and managed to wrest the assault rifle from the terrorist. Unfortunately, Al-Khazani shot him with his pistol. With Mugalian and Damien A. down, Al-Khazani moved towards the main part of the carriage with the clear intention of murdering the passengers on board the train. But after a rocky start, things only got worse for our shooter, fast. The modified assault rifle jammed. 10 meters away, Anthony Sadler sat with his best friends, Airman First Class Spencer Stone and Specialist Alex Scarlatos. As further discussed in Chapter 11, the unarmed Stone and Scarlatos would overpower the heavily armed terrorist with aid from others, and a massacre would be avoided. Quite apart from the bravery of the young men, from the point of view of systems design, when Ayoub Al-Khazani emerged from the restroom, stripped to the waist and armed, the system had already failed. He was not carrying any identification. The passengers who boarded from Amsterdam and Brussels airports had passed through layers of security, but at some point they crossed an invisible border into the unsecured landside. The security gap here is the wide open door of internal European travel, open also to dangerous individuals. Al-Khazani was not unknown. He had been flagged by the French, Spanish, German, and Belgian security services. He kept company with radical jihadists and was rumored to have traveled to Syria. Although he had been flagged, he was not followed because resources do not exist to follow every threat or protect every potential victim. Ayoub Al-Khazani represents a peculiar type of terrorist then. He is an internal threat, in some ways like the IRA in the UK or the Red Army faction in Germany. But his goals seem less focused, and his connections and cells appear much more diffuse, and he therefore sends less of a clear signal. It seems that he spent time with Abdelhamid Aboud, the leader of the 2015 Paris attacks, but the ties are weak. From the point of view of the intelligence community, Al-Khazani is one of many. A somewhat radicalized individual has not yet committed an act of terrorism. Moreover, if one nation alerts another as to the presence of an individual such as Al-Khazani, It is not clear if or how the information will be treated. Downstream from the world of intelligence, counter and terrorism combat teams only learned of this individual after the fact of his attack. Counterterrorism, as a professional matter, did not happen. To many counterterrorism experts, it seems clear that El-Khazzani failed because he had very bad luck. Unusually resilient individuals happened to be on board Carriage 12 on the day he chose to attack. Even then, he could still have succeeded but for a series of smaller failures, jammed weapons, and the like. Had it not been for chance, resilience, and failure, the Talus train attack would likely have resulted in a massacre. The security structures had failed. Once you open the box, anything can happen. Reinterpretation. As demonstrated by the ACI bulletin quoted above and by the discussion of the Talus attack, the meaning of airport for the purposes of airport security has changed. What appeared to be a stable concept turned out to be labile. Similarly, during the 9/11 attacks, terrorists forced their way into the cockpits of 4 planes, overpowered the pilots, and took control of at least 3 planes, which were flown into their targets. The 4th plane was evidently the scene of a battle and crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. In the aftermath of the attacks, airlines armored their cockpit doors so that terrorists would have difficulty getting to the pilot and taking over the plane's flight controls. As noted in Chapter 1, the German Wings Lufthansa disaster, a pilot waited until his co-pilot was out of the cockpit, locked the door, and flew the plane into a mountainside. What was first intended to be a fairly simple door was reimagined as a wall against terrorists, and then was reimagined again as a barricade. The general point here is that terrorism is an act of reinterpretation. At the simplest level, airports, or trains, or planes, or shopping malls, churches, mosques, synagogues, all have peaceable social functions, implying activities like travel, commerce, education, worship. The terrorist changes all that. Whatever such places normally mean, or were intended to mean, in consequence of mass violence, they become slaughterhouses. Oftentimes, after the fact, such reinterpretation is buried, unacknowledged. Reconstructed sites often make little or no acknowledgement of terrorist attacks. And there is something eerie about visiting a place now returned to normal and knowing. Reinterpretation extends to the realm of tactics, hence the game of castles and cannons. Returning to the 9/11 attacks, one of the reasons the attacks were so successful is that well into the morning of September 11th, airport security professionals understood hijacking, or thought they did, and for good reasons. Airports have long been admired by terrorists, and hijackings were common in the U.S. and elsewhere in the 60s and 70s. If hijackers succeeded in gaining control of a plane, a hostage situation ensued. The professional consensus was to negotiate in an effort to secure the safety of the passengers and also the plane. People were and are trained for hostage negotiations. Even if negotiations were unsuccessful, the process gave teams time to plan an intervention. For their part, hijackers usually had a list of demands, including such things as release of political prisoners, money, and safe passage. Security had control of the airport and, if necessary, the airspace, but the hijackers had leverage too, the passengers and the plane. Sometimes hijackings were violently resolved, as at Uganda's Entebbe airport. Sometimes negotiations prevented killing, but both sides expected to negotiate. There was a process. The attacks on 9/11, in contrast, followed a different script altogether. The passengers on the plane were not seen by the terrorists as hostages with which to bargain. The passengers were seen as casualties. This was bin Laden's war, and the point of the operation was to inflict losses upon the enemy. By the same token, the planes were not bargaining chips either, nor even modes of transportation. They were cruise missiles, with their fuel tanks taking the place of the explosive charge conventional in a purpose-built missile. The security community did not realize until it was too late that the script had been flipped. Again, as suggested in the introduction, these questions of meaning are not exclusively, nor even primarily, a matter for expertise. The experts who attempt to provide security by design are not necessarily proven wrong when security fails. The best of castle walls crumbles before a new cannon. The structures and flows of any civil society, the movements of people, are always vulnerable to dark-hearted reinterpretation. The intentions of the designers may be ignored, subverted, and their creations put to other ends. The future is poison. In 2017, Mark was invited to present ongoing research on public behavior during terrorist attacks to an invitation-only event in the UK. The 3-day meeting was held in an ex-Air Force base in rural England to facilitate the discreet demonstration of new counter-terror equipment. This was the second meeting of a loose network of European and international emergency responders, police, and various former active members of elite military branches. The network organized a panel of speakers for the first day, mainly populated by senior police officers. The opening speaker described the organizational dimensions of the police response to the London Bridge and Borough Market attacks. Mark described public behavior during the Glasgow and Tallis terrorist attacks based on his interviews with survivors and those who intervened, such as the Tallis train heroes. Members of France's famous Raid began a well-rehearsed analysis of the Charlie Hebdo massacre and the subsequent hostage situations. 2 days after the massacre, ISIS sympathizer Ahmadi Kulabi murdered a number of Jewish customers at a kosher supermarket in Port de Vincennes and was killed by Raid members. Meanwhile, 35 kilometers away, Saeed Kouachi and Sharif Kouachi impersonated police officers in order to gain entry to the offices of a signage company in Dammartin-en-Goële. The brothers held people at gunpoint for many hours until police forced them out of the building with explosives and shot them both dead. Raid, too, uses boxes. They conceptualize terrorist situations with concentric boxes, with the innermost box containing the terrorists and sometimes, unfortunately, civilians. The innermost box is essentially a kill zone, with its occupants, including the hostages, presumed already dead. Negotiation is not really the point. By the end of the presentations, the audience had numerous questions about hostage situations and sieges. As noted, the secret college is the realm of tactics. It was as if the ambiguous and disorderly complexity that is a terrorist attack could be ordered into a number of precise technical matters. Indeed, there was enough material presented that morning to keep people talking all day, and for the rest of that day and into the night, they talked and talked about lasers and locked doors, surveillance cameras and exterior walls, explosives and poison. The conversation really started on the way to lunch. Mark asked a question about the explosives used during the Dammartin-en-Goële siege. In order to explain the effect of flashbang grenades, a Dutch fire officer tried to explain the broader approach to breaching buildings. That is, how to force entry into a building or room so as to maximize the delivery of kinetic force and minimize risk to your own forces. During the conversation, he lost all interest in explosives. Lasers, he said over and over again, were the way forward. It turned out that there are several schools of thought, however, and each school of thought seemed to have a representative present at this event. The lunch table included a former British Army officer working as a consultant, an ex-counter-terror police officer, a member of a secretive military unit, the Dutch firemen who love lasers, a member of the German Federal Police, and a medical doctor from Belgium. As lunch was served, each person at the table, with the exception of the doctor, reflected on the Dammartin-en-Goële hostage crisis and the best options from their perspective. The atmosphere around the table was akin to that of a serious boardroom meeting. The ex-counter-terror police officer, for example, noted that the siege had lasted for over 8 hours, pointing to the protocols for hostage rescue that must be observed, even in the case of 2 terror suspects armed with, among other weapons, a rocket launcher. But that's time to gather intelligence, the former Army officer pointed out. If they're talking, you never know, said another. The conversation continued along this line, with everyone present agreeing that negotiation was a matter for negotiators, but while the talking was happening, their attack plan was already going into operation. The goal was to have the best plan, or series of plans, ready for a green light. We were back in the realm of tactics. Lasers, said the Dutch fire officer. It's the future for going through doors, and walls even. Due to the gravity of the topic, everyone thought it best to skip the next session and discuss the merits of lasers. The hours rolled by. A senior officer in Raid joined the discussion at one point to advocate on behalf of explosives and helicopter-based interventions, but withdrew quickly, blaming his poor English language skills. By late afternoon, the former British Army officer was leading the discussion. A charming individual with an Oxbridge manner and the attire of a wealthy farmer, he now operated a successful consultancy company that carried out risk assessments for multinational corporate infrastructure, focusing on the Middle East and Southeast Asia. He did not, however, push a corporate line during the debate. Rather, he was adamant that sufficient technology was already available for any situation. The key, he believed, was just well-trained people. To support this position, he recalled incidents in Northern Ireland, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The more that the former officer described places and events, however, the less frequently he used impersonal language, instead describing how he and the lads ran operations in various parts of the world. But eventually he ran out of steam, because the mysterious realm in which he operated was still a quasi-military one, and the tactics and technology required in a place like Paris plainly would be different. Pretty soon, the group had begun to arrange a mental tabletop exercise in which a suburban door had to be breached and some civilians rescued from two terrorists. It was decided unanimously to run the tabletop in the bar in the officers' mess. At some point that evening, Mark realized that he had been elected as the judge in this fiercely competitive battle of tactics. Mark stood at the bar in the ex-military base with 3 men standing in front of him, forming an inner circle. The former British Army officer tried his best to offer a human-centered strategy for how to neutralize the imagined threat and rescue the hostages. But this approach was too loose for another of the men in the inner circle, a German policeman with an engineering background. His thesis, which was hard to dispute, was that effective use of breaching charges and flashbangs could put you into the building immediately. "Lasers," the Dutch fire officer said in response to every claim. A number of years earlier, the German policemen had begun to experiment at home, inventing a whole package of hyper-specialized devices for removing structural barriers, from locks to fences and from reinforced doors to external walls. He combined several devices until he had a kit bag of bizarre medieval-looking equipment. Soon, he was known internationally as one of the leading international experts in the field of breaking into buildings. Famously, according to others present that day, he ended a hostile situation, a violent domestic dispute, in an attic by predicting when the hostage taker was maximally distant from his victims and then triggering a charge to undermine the floor beneath him. Nonetheless, by early evening, the Dutch fire officer's absolute faith in lasers seemed to be winning over the crowd. Then, to everyone's surprise, the Belgian doctor intervened. "Remember the Moscow theater siege?" he said. "Well, I invented the poison gas used to knock everyone out." In 2002, dozens of armed men attacked Moscow's Dubrovka theater and took hundreds of people hostage, demanding the withdrawal of Russian forces from Chechnya. Because of the difficulty of storming the theater and because of where the terrorists positioned the explosives, Russian special forces and intelligence officers elected to pump the building full of a toxic substance. The threats were neutralized and hundreds of hostages were rescued, but several hundred people also died from a variety of causes associated with the assault. Having only vague memories of the incident, Mark asked the Belgian doctor for more details. He described his work as a medical examiner during the 1990s and his growing sense that terrorism was likely to be a major challenge for Europe following 9/11. Why, he wondered, while watching a popular espionage film one day, had nobody ever perfected a sleeping gas? He began experiments in his garage at home. "My wife found me twice unconscious on the floor," he recalled. But then he got somewhere. He approached a German colleague in a university biochemistry lab to assist with the empirical work, but was rejected. Eventually, he found a Russian colleague who could help. "And what about all those people who died?" Mark asked. The doctor patiently explained that most of the fatalities in the Dubrovka theater occurred either when people fell unconscious in seats and their airways closed, tongue prolapse, or when emergency workers piled them on their backs on the pavement outside. The gas worked, he said, not without pride. Everyone else had gone quiet. Secret colleges have informal codes, invisible lines, taboos even. "Well," the doctor said with a shrug before taking his leave, "the future is poison." Attempting to achieve safety by design is an inevitable response to danger, as old as piling rocks in front of a cave. In principle, however, authorities that attempt to design safe spaces confront 3 ultimately insoluble problems. Infinite regress, in a design context often called castles and cannons. Definition, spatial or otherwise. As the landslide problem illustrates, danger may elude managerial definition, fall outside the jurisdiction. Reinterpretation, terrorism contests peaceable understandings. Contemporary social and political discourse commonly positions policy and the agencies that attempt to effectuate it as at least in principle rational. Weber's disenchantment with modern life stems from the gradual replacement of organic social life with coldly rational structures. Someday, everything will be subject to rules, and there will be no joy. Bureaucracy, in Weber, will be addressed in more sustained fashion later on, but so far, this book has painted a different picture of bureaucratic existence. Expert bureaucrats cannot know the public they are meant to serve. Indeed, relations with the public are downright spooky. That was Chapter 4. Bureaucrats acknowledge the insufficiency of their knowledge and their inability to handle the knowledge they do possess and are generally haunted by the specter of failure. Chapter 5. Their efforts to learn are hindered by ignorance over what happened, and where the facts are reasonably certain, radical differences of interpretation. Chapter 6. More distressingly still, the effort to encompass and organize the social at the core of the bureaucratic enterprise, to design a safe airport, say, is beset by fundamental problems. Chapter 7. Rather than rational expressions of the will of the state, the enterprise of bureaucracy, the rationalization of the social, might better be seen as in principle impossible, but the effort is required nonetheless. The practice of bureaucracy is Sisyphean. Should we sympathize with Sisyphus? To some extent, certainly. He is not the cold monster that the social sciences have grown so comfortable hating. Sisyphus, too, is imprisoned by his circumstances, with few options. Yet, pursuit of security in the teeth of problems endemic to bureaucracy is not only both necessary, what else could be done, and endless, but also strangely disturbing, even nauseating, poisonous. The logics of expertise extend indefinitely. Followed to their bitter end, experts will in fact create something akin to what Weber called the iron cage, an insufferable modernity. It is small comfort that, as Kant understood but Weber sometimes forgot, logics are rarely followed to their bitter end, and the better sort of person may buy their way around the most onerous aspects of the contemporary. Modernity, nonetheless, often becomes dreary. Sometimes rebellion becomes an object of fantasy, not least in the secret college itself. Sometimes violence erupts. As will be developed further below, the vital question is when have things become modern enough, and it is time to stop.